Welcome to Introduction to Philosophy, Philosophy 1101 here at the University of Connecticut. I'm very glad to have you with us this semester, and we'll be doing something different this semester. You are involved in the different thing that we're doing already because much of our work for the course will involve having videos that incorporate the contents of lectures that I would normally give in a regular lecture hall, in a regular classroom, but I'm asking you to watch these lectures online on your laptop or tablet or whatever works best for you so that you'll be able to come to class with some background already with you and ready to discuss these issues, the issues that we'll be discussing this semester in class so that we can all get more out of our work together this semester. So by way of that project, I'll be talking today about the nature of argumentation and how to assess arguments. This is our first major unit for this Introduction to Philosophy class. So for an outline for today, we'll be talking first about the different kinds of grounds for belief. Then we'll move on to what I'll describe as three different kinds of justification for a belief. Then we'll be talking about a particular topic, justifying belief in a so-called GCB, or a greatest conceivable being, which will be our topic for next week when we get into what's known as the philosophy of religion. Then we'll move into, after having talked about those types of case for just a moment, we'll dig more deeply into the nature of an argument, what an argument is, how to take it apart and analyze it, and then we'll talk about how to assess arguments on two different dimensions, one known as soundness, the other one known as validity. Then we'll give some examples of arguments and see whether our tests for soundness and validity apply to them and how they apply to them. From there, we'll move on to some famous fallacies that I'll be asking you to watch out for, be on your guard against in the reasoning both of yourself and others. And then we'll close with a quick discussion of how one wants to use this new skill you're just acquiring in a thoughtful and empathetic way that involves not stepping on other people's toes as you criticize their arguments. So that's what we'll end with. So, by way of our first topic, I want to talk about different kinds of ground for belief. We're often asked questions of the form, why do you think that? Often when somebody says, here's my view about right and wrong, about the existence of God, about what the government ought to do, somebody else will ask, why do you think that? What's your basis? Or sometimes when I'm thinking about my own position, I'll ask myself, why I think the thing that I do. Where does my belief come from? Or sometimes a parent who's having a conversation with a child will be forced, sometimes too often, to answer questions of the form, why is that true, or why should I think that? We're often called upon to give what are called grounds for one or other of our beliefs. But the idea of a ground for a belief is actually ambiguous. And it could either refer to what I'm going to call a causal or historical ground, or it could refer to what I'm going to call a ground that justifies the belief in some way. And my main point that I want you to focus on right now is that a causal or historical so-called ground for a belief, if we cite that, if we invoke that, only gives the listener an answer to the question, where does that belief come from? Where did that belief originate? And we can often cite where a belief originated, where it comes from, without giving any justification for it at all. That is to say, if somebody says, suppose you come across a friend who expresses a kind of racist attitude, and you challenge that friend, you say, well, why do you think that? Why do you think, for example, that skin color, ethnicity, whatever, is relevant to a person's legitimate right to get an education or be a viable applicant for a job or something of the sort? They might say, well, I was brought up to think that way. Now, that's a very common answer to a question of the form, why do you think that? But if you consider it carefully, it seems to me you'll probably see that that answer that refers to how you were brought up does not itself provide any justification for the belief as such. Because, after all, if this person was brought up in a household full of racist people, or people who discriminated against others on the basis of their gender or sexual orientation, that wouldn't make the belief okay, that wouldn't justify it, that wouldn't make it a reasonable belief to have. Right? So that is, that I want to suggest to you now is just because a person cites where their belief came from, what the source or origin of it is, does not by itself tell you anything about whether that belief is justified. I can give you an extremely detailed story about the origins or causes of my beliefs without for a moment giving any reason to think that that belief is correct or reasonable or justified. So another way to put this is, if you were talking to a person who is completely neutral on the question whether they should believe, for example, whether skin color or gender or sexual orientation makes a difference for a person's legitimacy in applying for a job, something of the kind, if you were to cite just the cause of your belief, the origin of your belief as to why, if you thought that, why those differences do make a difference for their rights, that would probably not persuade that neutral person. That neutral person probably would just say, well, I now understand how you came to have the belief that you do, but that doesn't seem to show in any way that the belief is reasonable or justified. It just tells me that you inherited it from other people who themselves might be biased in one way or another. So when we talk about grounds for belief, I want you to be sensitive to the way in which there's a real ambiguity in that notion. A notion of ground. The notion of ground is ambiguous between a basis that just is causal or historical on the one hand, and something that is more persuasive, more reasonable, more powerful, namely a justification. So when we have a justification for a belief, we can then provide something that might persuade or convince somebody who's neutral on the question. We might be able to provide a justification that might win somebody over to our side once they see the reason for the belief in question. Okay? So once we're focusing on the distinction between grounds for a belief that are just causal or historical and grounds for a belief that give some kind of justification, we might then ask, well, what would a justification be like, a legitimate justification and not just a causal or historical basis? Notice also that if you ask somebody for the ground for a belief and they give you not so much a cause or historical basis, but something more like, well, believing this makes me feel better. That, again, I'm suggesting shouldn't justify somebody else in accepting that belief as well, and I'm not sure whether it should justify them as well. We'll have to come back, especially when we talk next week about issues in the philosophy of religion, whether making you feel better is a good enough reason to have a belief in question. You can see how there are many topics in which just it's making you feel better is not likely to provide any justification for that belief at all. If somebody's got a belief that, for example, for instance, a certain kind of medicine is likely to cure a certain disease, then that might make them feel better, but that doesn't seem to be any evidence that, in fact, the medicine is efficacious in any way. So there might be other special cases in which being made to feel better by a belief is some kind of justification for it, but we'll have to be careful about precisely what sort of justification that is. Okay, so it's important to distinguish, first of all, between grounds for a belief that justify and grounds for a belief that don't, and next we'll move on to the question, well, if we're looking for justifications, not just causes, what would those justifications look like? So our question now is, what does justify a belief? What sorts of things would make a belief be a justified thing to have? And I should say that a belief can always be expressed as the content or the thought connected with an indicative sentence. Regardless of the language in which the sentence is expressed, a belief is something of the form, lightning is caused by electrical discharge, or the United States should never intervene in the affairs of another country, something of the kind. Those are always going to be beliefs, whereas shut the door, U.S. out of Central America or South America or something of the kind, those are more like imperatives and are not beliefs, and so are not so much the things we're talking about just yet, although in a few weeks we'll be talking more about justifications for things that have more directly to do with action. But for now, I just want to talk about beliefs and how they can be justified. And when we talk about justifications for belief, I want to discuss three different kinds. First of all, what I'll call theoretical justifications. Secondly, what I will call pragmatic justifications. And third, what I'll call moral justifications. So theoretical, pragmatic, and moral justifications are the three general categories that we could cite that could possibly justify a belief. First of all then, what is a theoretical justification? A theoretical justification is a set of evidence or support that makes it likely that a certain belief or proposition is correct. It's the stuff of science. It's the stuff of history. It's the stuff of mathematics, where we give some evidence either in the form of observational data, statistical analysis, photographs sometimes, historical evidence, archaeological evidence, things of the sort that can provide some justification to the fact that a certain proposition is true. Okay? So the idea is going to be, we're going to be able to give evidence that will support general belief of a certain proposition, such as that smoking tends to cause cancer, such as that most people who don't wear helmets while riding motorcycles when they get in accidents end up doing very badly. Things of that sort are going to be theoretical justifications that will potentially justify a belief. Whereas by contrast, a pragmatic justification is one that is a little bit unusual, but you can imagine it going something like the following way. A pragmatic justification is a justification that purports to show that having a belief is reasonable because it's in your best interest to hold the belief in question. So for example, if a certain person is in a dangerous situation while, for instance, climbing in the mountains, if they're believing that they're going to be able to make it to safety, actually increases their chances of, in fact, making it to safety, then that might very well be a pragmatic justification of the belief in question. There might not be a whole lot of evidence outside their belief itself that they're likely to be able to make it to safety, but if they're believing that they can, is going to increase their confidence, increase their sense of self-assurance, make them less likely to falter and stumble and get freaked out by the danger in question, then that would be a justification, because it does in fact increase their chances of making the belief true. So a pragmatic justification is one that seems to support a belief in a slightly circuitous way, but I don't want to rule it out. And in fact, next week when we talk about justifications for certain kinds of theistic beliefs or belief in God, we're going to see some famous philosophers providing what they call pragmatic justifications for precisely that kind of belief. And then another perhaps unusual case, but also one that I want to leave on the table for now, is a moral justification for a belief. Sometimes we might feel that we're morally obligated to believe something. For example, suppose you've got a good friend who's been accused of a crime, and you want to stick by your friend. Friends, what they do is to stick up for one another as much as possible. You might feel that you're under a moral obligation to believe that that friend is innocent unless you've got very compelling evidence to the contrary. That moral justification might not be one that you would feel if you were just someone who knew the friend in question but were not friends with that person, just a bystander. That person might be more likely to conclude on the basis of the evidence available that that person is in fact guilty of the crime. But you, as a friend, might feel morally obligated to have a different view, or at least hold back on the idea of believing that they're guilty until you get more compelling evidence. So then I want to distinguish among, within the area of those justifications as opposed to just causes or historical explanations, justifications for belief, I want us to distinguish between those that provide theoretical justification, pragmatic justification, and moral justification. And I should say that most of what you study in college when you're reading about biology or history, chemistry, archaeology, astronomy, etc., the vast majority of that is about theoretical justification. Scientists, historians, others trying to answer questions about how things are, generally speaking, when they try to answer those questions, they're going to be trying to provide theoretical justifications for the beliefs that they're trying to support. That's the very, very heart of the game of scientific, historical, social scientific exploration. But I also want to leave open to us the possibility of pragmatic justifications as well as moral justifications. And when you start to examine, as I'll be hoping you'll do a great deal of in the course of the semester, when you start to examine your beliefs, ask yourself, well, why do I think that about what's right and wrong, about our treatment of non-human animals, about children, about suicide? Why do I think that about the rights of government, things of the kind? I'll be asking you to provide justifications for your beliefs, and then I'll also be asking you to think about whether or not those justifications are theoretical, practical, pragmatic rather, or moral, and whether or not those differences make a difference what sort of justifications what we're looking for. So just to give a flavor of what we'll be moving into very soon, we'll be looking into questions of the form, if you are a theist, if you believe that there is a kind of greatest conceivable being, regardless of whether that takes the form of being Christian or Muslim or Jewish or some other religious kind of creed, you're likely to have some inclination to believe in a being than which there is no greater. And then the question is, if that's something that you believe, then what is your justification for that belief? And we'll be examining some of the more famous attempts to justify beliefs of that sort. For example, we'll be looking at what's known as the argument from design, which tries to show that the extraordinary amount of design or at least apparent design and complexity in the natural world seems to prove that there must have been an intelligent, sentient designer that's responsible for all of it. We'll also be considering the cosmological argument that tries to show that the only possible explanation for all that exists, whether it's complex or not, but just the sheer fact that things exist at all requires an explanation that makes appeal to a GCB. We'll be talking about the ontological argument that tries to show that the very concept of a greatest conceivable being implies by definition that such a being must exist. We'll be talking about an argument from morality that says somehow that in some way believing in a GCB is morally justified because, for example, it makes you a better person. We'll also be considering questions of the form, these are questions that come in the form of what used to be known as natural religion. That's not so much a term that's used today, but it was the case a couple of centuries ago that natural religion was the project of trying to justify a theistic belief on the basis of theoretical justification as opposed, for example, to divine revelation, something of the kind. Okay. So you might also for now think about the question, can there be a practical or pragmatic on the one hand or moral justification for belief in a greatest conceivable being as well? That's something we'll be considering in the fullness of time too. But let me just clarify that for our purposes, especially in a public university like ours, I want us to make sure that we're extremely clear about the difference between the church on the one hand and state on the other. I'm going to be asking you to examine your religious, ethical, and other deeply held beliefs in the course of this semester, and I'll be asking you to look at your own views critically and perhaps engage critically with other people. But let me be clear that I'm not trying to proselytize, debunk, or otherwise change your mind about anything in particular. Instead, what I'm trying to do is get you to approach those beliefs, consider them, ask yourself whether they're beliefs that are justified in the way that you want them to be. If not, then consider changing them, but that's entirely up to you and not something that I want to or am in any position to legislate at all. It's more a matter of you're taking a look at your belief system and seeing what things that are in it are things that you want to stick with, things that you think are still justified and appropriate, or if not, things that need to be modified in some way. And to that end, I want to be clear that I'm very much taken by the remark of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "In a republican nation whose citizens are to be led by reason and persuasion and not by force, the art of reasoning becomes of the first importance." That seems to be a very powerful remark insofar as Jefferson is suggesting that a bulwark of democracy is the ability to look at arguments, look at lines of reasoning, and to see whether or not they are persuasive, as opposed to governing a population by force. We, in a democracy, want to have our minds changed not by fear, but rather by persuasion. And arguments and their assessment are at the heart of that very process. So too, this same Jefferson, where he's buried in Monticello, has on the obelisk that makes up his tombstone remarks that say Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States. He was signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was also author of the Statute of Religious Freedom for the state of Virginia. That Statute of Religious Freedom for the state of Virginia is the one that I'm focusing on now, because that was one of the early pillars of the separation of church and state for Jefferson and the democracy that came in his wake. And so what I want to suggest to you is that while we will in the course of the semester be considering and asking you to reconsider many of your deeply held beliefs, again, I want to be sure that we're clear that there's no crossing of a line between church and state here, but rather I'll be asking you to think about your views and then changing them if you choose to do so, if you see fit. If you think that your views are fine as they are, then I'll be happy to see them stay the way they were when you came into this course. Okay, so to that end, I want to focus on what an argument is. And I'm going to characterize an argument as a line of reasoning that purports to establish a conclusion. So essentially, an argument is an attempt to justify, provide not just a cause or origin story about a belief, but to be able to justify it in order to show that a certain conclusion is a correct one. Now, that's to say that the ordinary English word argument is not quite the same as the way in which I'm using the word here, because arguments in everyday English are often thought of as being loud and involving intense emotions and sometimes throwing of dishes around the room and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an argument that can be carried on perfectly coolly and calmly, probably better to be carried on in that way as well, and is one that tries to give evidence in the form of premises and use those premises to support a conclusion. Breaking that up a little bit is going to consist of a set of propositions, including premises and a conclusion. A proposition, I've mentioned before, is the idea that is expressed by an indicative sentence no matter what the language is in which it's expressed. So 2 + 2 is 4, all people are created equal, smoking tends to cause cancer, are all propositions that are capable of being either true or false and that are there for the grasping, whether or not anybody happens to be thinking of the proposition in question. So a proposition is a kind of abstract object that is what is expressed by an indicative sentence in a language, but it does not have to be being thought of by anybody in particular at a certain time. Think about a proposition is not too different from numbers. They're there for the grasping. They've got their own properties independently of our minds, and they're useful because they can be cited as it were, the constituents of arguments. So an argument then is going to be a set of premises, and the beginning few of that argument, of that set of premises, is going to be what is known as the support or the premise set for the argument, and that premise set is going to make an effort at least to support a conclusion, which is what we're trying to establish. So more abstractly, the essence of an argument is going to be, we can characterize as P sub 1, where each P is a proposition, P sub 2, P sub 3, all the way down for some finite number up to P sub n, and then there will often be a horizontal line indicating that these are supposed to be the premise set for the argument, and under that line is what's known as the conclusion, proposition C. P1 through Pn are the premises, C is the conclusion. That's going to be the essential structure of an argument for our purposes. Likewise, when we assess an argument, we want to ask the question, well, which of the arguments that we can formulate, which ones are the good ones? Which ones are the persuasive or cogent ones? Those are the ones, that's what we're looking for, and at the same time looking for ways in which when somebody else formulates an argument, how can we tell whether it's any good? Does it contain a pitfall? Does it contain a fallacy in some way? And if so, how? We'll be spending a lot of time in the course of the semester constructing, analyzing, and assessing arguments, and it's a skill that, like mathematics or even like learning a language, is something that it's important to try to master fairly early on, and if you can get on top of the art of argumentation fairly early, you'll have it pay off for you for the rest of your life. It's hard to come too late, not impossible, but more difficult, but the earlier you master the art of argument and their assessment, the better off you'll be, I guarantee it. Now, skill in argumentation not only helps you to persuade others, but it also enables you to replace your opinions with knowledge and the causes, the things that might have caused your beliefs, with things that purport to be justifications for those beliefs. So that's why it seems to me arguments in their assessment is very important. Now, when we get into that assessment project, we want to distinguish among two different aspects. One is going to be the question is, are all the premises in that argument true? Are those premises ones that we can take to be accepted? Another question is going to be, if all the premises are true, would that guarantee the truth of the conclusion? Those are two separate questions. One is, are all the premises true? The other one is, if they were all true, would that guarantee the truth of the conclusion? The first can happen without the second happening, and in fact the second can happen even without the first happening. We'll have to see some of that in more detail. So now, in assessing an argument, we want to distinguish between two different questions, and I'm going to give you technical notions, two of them. One is the notion of validity, the other one is that of soundness. And I'm going to define an argument as valid just in case there's no way for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Another way of putting that is, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. That does not, notice, imply that all the premises are in fact true. So an argument can be valid even if not all the premises are true. What validity comes to is an if-then kind of claim. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true too. But that's a big if on which a lot hangs. So validity is just the if-then statement, whereas soundness is different from that. Soundness is the argument is valid and all the premises are true. So soundness builds on the notion of validity. To be sound, an argument has to be valid, but it also has to have something else, namely true premises. And these are very abstract notions, and they're not going to be very intuitive for you just yet. But I want to try to put this idea to work in order to show how it's actually useful in the assessment of arguments. Okay? So remember that validity and soundness are both technical terms. They're not the same words that are used in everyday English or other natural languages, and we just want to focus on how we're going to be using those for our purposes of this course. Now, can we give an example of an argument that is valid but not sound? I said validity does not imply soundness, because you could have validity even if not all the premises are true. So here's an argument. Premise number 1, all 10-legged creatures have wings. Premise number 2, all spiders have 10 legs. Now, if those two premises are true, all spiders have 10 legs, and all 10-legged creatures have wings, what can we infer from that? Well, I think that we can infer that all spiders have wings. Now, that's strange because you know that not all spiders have wings. In fact, I don't know if I'm sure that most spiders don't have wings. Do any spiders have wings? I don't know the answer to that question. But it's certainly not true that all spiders have wings. So we know the conclusion's not true. But wait, this argument I claim is valid nonetheless, because it is the case that if, remember it's a big if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. Think of it this way. If you were in a possible world in which premise 1 and premise 2 are both true, that would also be a world in which all spiders have wings. If you're in a world in which all spiders have 10 legs, and in that same world it was also the case that all 10-legged creatures have wings, you would also know that you're in a world in which all spiders have wings. That is to say, the argument's valid, which is cashed out as the idea that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Again, I'm not saying the premises are true, I'm just saying if the premises are, then the conclusion must be true as well. Notice that we use hypothetical reasoning like this all the time. I'm going to say things like, if I were to take the bus, then I would get to the baseball game on time. It's no objection to me to say, but you weren't planning on taking the bus. I might say, but I'm just saying if. If that were the case, I'd be able to get to the game on time. For you to reply, I'm not planning on it, is not really relevant. Likewise, if the question is validity, we're just talking about if the premises are true, would the conclusion be true as well? And I'm suggesting that this argument is valid, but it's not sound. Why is it not sound? Well, let's go back to the definition of soundness. To be sound, you have to be both valid and have all true premises, and I think you can see that premises 1 and 2 are not all true. In particular, premise 2 is clearly not true. Let's try another application of our definitions of soundness and validity. Can we have an argument that has true premises but is not valid? Well, let's try this example. Premise number 1. If I owned all the gold in Fort Knox, I'd be rich. That seems true, and likewise, it also seems true that I don't own all the gold in Fort Knox. Let's look at those two premises. The conclusion is, consider the conclusion being, I'm not rich. Now, is this argument valid? The premises are true, but does the truth of the premises guarantee that the conclusion must be true as well? Well, no, because I might be rich in some other way, right? Perhaps I had a patent on something that everybody wants, and I get lots of royalties from it, something of the kind. That might be another way of becoming rich. So just because I didn't get richness, my wealth, in the way that involves having all the gold in Fort Knox does not guarantee that I'm not rich. There might be some other source of funds. So there is an example in which I've got true premises and an argument, but still the argument is not valid. So just because you look at an argument and find that its premises are true does not show that the argument is a valid one. You need more. Okay? And this particular argument fallacy is known as the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Just because the antecedent of the if-then statement in number 1 is not true does not mean that the conclusion can't hold as well. Okay. Here's another example of the same general point that I'm trying to make here. Here's another example of an argument that has true premises but is still not valid. Premise number one. If it rained last night, the streets are wet. Seems true. And it might also, let's suppose also that the streets are wet. So our two premises are true. Therefore, it rained last night. Let's think about this. We know that if it rained last night, the streets are wet, and we look outside and we say, yep, the streets are wet. Therefore, it rained last night. Is that a valid argument? Well, not according to our definition, because it might be the case that the streets are wet for some other reason. Premise one only tells us that if it rained last night, the streets are wet. But it doesn't mean that, in fact, that's what caused the wetness of the streets. Perhaps the street cleaning truck just came by and sprayed the streets down in the course of washing them and brushing them up and so forth. That might be why the streets are wet. That does not have to be the explanation. The rain, that is, does not have to be the explanation as to why it is the streets are wet. So we have now two examples of arguments that have true premises but are not valid. Okay. What about soundness? Here's an example of an argument that might be sound. Let's think about it. Premise one, all mammals have lungs. Two, all whales are mammals. Therefore, conclusion, all whales have lungs. I'm fairly sure that the first premise is true. Let's suppose that it is, that all mammals have lungs. Premise one. Premise two, all whales are mammals. I'm suggesting that not only are both premises one and two true, but that if they're true, the conclusion has to be true as well. That's an example, a sort of paradigm example of a sound argument. Now, here's a question for you. Does soundness guarantee validity? Consider that for a moment. So we'll be asking you to look at lots of different arguments that are provided in more abstract contexts as well as slightly more concrete contexts, such as what you get in a newspaper article in which the author is trying to argue for a conclusion, an op-ed piece, maybe even in advertising, in political campaigns. You'll see people trying to give arguments for certain conclusions, and your job will be to take a look at some of them and see whether or not they are persuasive, whether or not they are, and that's going to break up into the questions whether or not they're valid and whether they're sound, and if not, how do they fail? What's wrong with them? And in order to help you with that task, I want to give you some examples of some fairly famous fallacies. Here's a list. There's one type of fallacy known as the fallacies, this family of fallacies known as the fallacies of composition and division. The fallacy of composition is a fallacy according to which, from the premise that a number of components of a thing have a certain property, somebody might infer that the entire aggregate has a certain property as well. So, for example, from the premise that each of the grains of sand in a large pile of sand, each of the grains of sand is small, we certainly can't infer that the entire mound or hill of sand is small. That'd be a fallacy of composition. And likewise, this fallacy of division. From the fact that a composite object has a certain property, we can't infer that the components of that object have that property as well. There might be, for example, a country that is wealthy or a country that is powerful. That does not imply that the citizens are either wealthy or powerful. Perhaps all the wealth and power are held in the hands of a very small oligarchy or something of the kind. So it's a fallacy to infer from the properties of a set of components to any conclusion about the property of the complex, and likewise, it's a fallacy to infer from properties of the complex to any conclusion about the properties of the components of the complex. Here's another famous fallacy known as post hoc ergo propter hoc. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is Latin for, roughly speaking, it happened after, therefore it happened because of. So take an example such as, I pray for rain, because I'm a farmer and I need my crops to grow, and lo and behold, it rains. I infer my prayers were answered. But the fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, it's a fallacy to reason that way, because the fact that first this happened, then that happened, does not itself show that what happened was a result of the thing that I did first. It might be that my prayers were answered, or it might just be that I got lucky, or I take the medicine and I got better. But it's a further question whether or not taking the medicine is what made me get better. Perhaps I was going to be getting better anyway. So watch out for reasoning that involves it happened implicitly, it happened afterwards, therefore it happened because of. Much more needs to be done to establish that causal relationship as opposed to just temporal precedence. Another example of a fallacy is known as the fallacy of equivocation, where we play upon different meanings or disambiguations of words or phrases. So, for example, think about the sentence, every event has a cause. Everything that happens because of some reason. Now, that could either mean there's one big reason that caused everything, or it could be everything that happens has the characteristic that there's something that caused it, but the something that caused it might not have been the same thing from case to case. Just as you might say, every person loves somebody. Well, does that mean there's one person that everybody loves? Or does it mean for everybody you find, there's at least someone that they love, who is not necessarily the same one from one person to the other? We can equivocate, as we're going to see when we talk about certain forms of the cosmological argument, equivocate on this notion of every X is related to some Y or other, and that can be a source of fallacious reasoning as well. That's the fallacy of equivocation. We also have fallacies known as ad hominem arguments, where we try to refute somebody's line of reasoning, show their line of reasoning is baseless by attacking the person that is the basis or the source of that line of reasoning. So suppose, for example, that a person is arguing that they're providing evidence that smoking is a carcinogen and is therefore bad for one's health, and an investigative reporter finds out that the scientist who's providing that evidence is herself a smoker. Now, that might be slightly embarrassing for the scientist in question to have had that fact revealed about her life, but that doesn't show that the evidence purporting to establish the carcinogenic properties of smoking is itself less good evidence than we thought. What she does in her own spare time is really irrelevant to the question whether or not her evidence supports the conclusion that she's trying to support about the carcinogenic properties of smoking. So an ad hominem argument tries to show that the person providing a line of reasoning is herself or himself illegitimate or immoral or questionable or dubious in some way. Just showing that does not itself undermine the validity or soundness of the reasoning that she's offering. Watch out for fallacies that involve that ad hominem type of attack. Likewise, people will sometimes engage in what's known as an argument from authority, trying to establish a certain proposition by appealing to the idea that someone famous believed it, said it, expressed it, or supported it. For example, just because Einstein thought something about the existence of God does not by itself show that God exists. Perhaps in spite of his genius, Einstein might have made a mistake in that particular case. Just because someone famous, a great authority figure, thinks something to be true does not itself show that it is. Likewise, another type of argument that is a little more subtle, but is one that I want you to be clear on, is known as begging the question. Where begging the question is a sort of technical notion for assuming what we're trying to establish. So when a person tries to establish a conclusion, if their premises already in some ways smuggle in the assumption that they're trying to, the proposition that they're trying to prove, then that's known as begging the question. So for example, in the book Dead Man Walking, the author, Helen Prejean, describes in her support of the idea that the death penalty is immoral, she describes the death penalty with the term judicial murder. Now, it might be the case that applying the death penalty is a case of judicial murder, but if you're trying to show that the death penalty is wrong, then assuming that a judge sentencing someone to death is a form of murder already assumes that the death penalty is morally wrong, because murder is by definition morally wrong. So to describe in your argument for the conclusion that the death penalty is immoral, to describe a judge as giving somebody the death penalty as a sentence as a case of judicial murder already begs the question, that is to say, it assumes precisely what you're trying to establish. That's another kind of fallacy. And likewise, more generally, people sometimes describe arguments as being circular, as assuming what they're trying to establish. Watch out for that. That is a pitfall for arguments, but I should also say that our tools, our technology, as it were, for assessing arguments in certain terms of soundness and validity does not quite give us a powerful way to explain how that particular fallacy is in fact a fallacy. Because if you think about it, you'll see that an argument that contains as one of its premises the proposition that it's trying to establish might still be a valid one. So it's something that we'll need to be mindful of as our work together progresses. And I'll ask you to think about the question, could an argument be both sound and circular? That's something I'll be asking you to reflect on. Now, what we've talked about thus far is fairly abstract, and I'll be giving you lots of examples of arguments that we find in everyday life in which we'll be trying to assess whether or not those arguments really are cogent, that is, are not just valid but also sound, and if not, where they commit one kind of fallacy or another. You'll be developing your skills throughout the semester in assessing arguments, constructing arguments, etc. But I would like to ask you now to try to be relatively empathetic in your understanding of others and your treatment of others as you develop your skills in argumentation and the assessment of arguments, because it's easy to step on somebody's toes, as it were, when you find fallacies in their reasoning. I've myself committed the mistake of criticizing others a little bit too aggressively when I found them reasoning fallaciously and hurting their feelings as a result. And I want to suggest that you not make the same mistakes that I have in this particular area. Reasoning is cognitively very demanding. Constructing an argument, thinking through a complex line of reasoning is intellectually very challenging. It's very daunting. We're all liable to pitfalls of various kinds. We're all fallible in this kind of area. And what I want to suggest to you is that if you find a mistake in somebody else's reasoning, then be gentle about it, be empathetic about it, and try to understand where they're coming from, why they might have made the mistake that they have, in order to reach across the aisle, as it were, and understand things from their point of view. That does not make the fallacy in their reasoning go away necessarily, but it might help you understand how they committed the fallacy that they did. It might also help you understand how gently to get them to reconsider their point of view once they've had the fallacious nature of the reasoning made intelligible to them. So I want to suggest be kind to other people's feelings when criticizing, challenging their lines of reasoning, because that will probably be something that pays you back as others make an effort to be kind to you if they find mistakes, fallacies of various kinds in your reasoning as well. Again, reasoning is hard. Reasoning is demanding. It's something that we're all prone to errors in, and something that we all want to do as much as we can to support one another so we can all together reason as cogently and as effectively as we can.